January 10th, 2026, 2:34 a.m. Beijing time. China's Ministry of Commerce issues Emergency Directive 2026-001 imposing immediate export restrictions on 17 rare earth elements classified as critical to foreign military production. 72 hours later, Pentagon procurement officers confirmed that American defense contractors have exhausted domestic rare earth stockpiles with no alternative suppliers available. 48 hours after that, production lines for F-35 components, guided missile systems and advanced radar arrays began shutting down across the United States. I've analysed strategic resource dependencies for 3 decades. I briefed administrations on supply chain vulnerabilities when most policymakers treated economic security as separate from military preparedness. And what's unfolding with China's rare earth restrictions isn't economic policy. It's the weaponization of geological monopoly against military systems that cannot function without materials controlled by a single adversary. Let me show you how 17 elements nobody discussed in public became the leverage point that could cripple American defense production. Rare earth elements aren't rare geologically. They're rare economically because extraction requires environmentally destructive processing that most countries refuse to permit on their territory. The 17 elements, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and 13 others, exist in deposits worldwide. But refining them produces toxic waste that contaminates groundwater, destroys ecosystems, and creates long-term environmental damage. For decades, the United States accepted this trade-off. American companies mined and refined rare earths domestically despite environmental costs because these materials were essential for emerging technologies. But in the 1990s, environmental regulations tightened, cleanup costs increased, and China offered an alternative. Chinese state-owned enterprises could process rare earths at lower cost because environmental regulations were minimal and labor was cheap. American companies couldn't compete. One by one, domestic rare earth operations shut down. Mountain Pass in California, once the world's largest rare earth mine, closed in 2002. Refining capacity moved offshore, and within 15 years, China controlled 90% of global rare earth refining. This wasn't market forces, it was strategic planning. Chinese officials understood that rare earths were essential for military systems, renewable energy, and advanced electronics. Control the supply, control the industries that depend on them. And industries that depend on rare earths include every modern weapon system in the American arsenal. F-35 fighter jets require approximately 920 pounds of rare earth materials per aircraft, each one. Neodymium for electric motors, praseodymium for jet engines, dysprosium for guidance systems. Without these materials, the F-35 cannot fly. Without Chinese exports, there is no alternative source at current production scales. Guided missiles depend on rare earth magnets for targeting systems. Submarines use rare earth alloys for silent propulsion. Drones require rare earth components for navigation. Radar systems cannot detect threats without rare earth elements in their processing arrays. Every advanced weapon system America produces depends on materials refined almost exclusively in China, and everyone knew this. Pentagon reports going back to 2010 identified rare earth dependency as critical strategic vulnerability. Multiple administrations commissioned studies. Defense officials testified before Congress. The warnings were explicit, repeated, and ignored, because addressing the vulnerability required accepting costs that nobody wanted to pay. Rebuilding domestic rare earth refining capacity would take a decade and tens of billions of dollars. It would require relaxing environmental regulations or accepting contamination. It would mean higher weapons costs and slower production. Every option was politically difficult, economically expensive, and operationally complex, so nothing happened. American defense contractors continued sourcing rare earths from China. Pentagon procurement continued approving Chinese-sourced components, and the vulnerability that everyone acknowledged remained unaddressed because the cost of fixing it exceeded the immediate political pain of accepting risk. Until China decided the risk calculation had changed. Emergency Directive 2026-001 didn't emerge from nowhere. It followed specific escalations in US-China confrontation over Taiwan, trade restrictions and technology transfer controls, but the immediate trigger was American secondary sanctions targeting Chinese companies doing business with Russia. On December 18, 2025, the US Treasury Department announced sanctions against 17 Chinese corporations for providing dual-use technology to Russian military forces. These weren't symbolic penalties. They blocked access to US financial systems, prohibited American companies from trading with sanctioned entities, and threatened third parties who violated restrictions. China's response was immediate but not public. Behind closed doors, Chinese officials began preparing economic retaliation that would impose costs exceeding anything American sanctions could achieve, and rare earths provided the perfect leverage point. The restriction doesn't ban exports completely. That would violate WTO obligations and invite international retaliation. Instead, Emergency Directive 2026-001 requires Chinese companies to obtain export licenses for rare earth shipments to countries that have imposed sanctions on Chinese entities. The licensing process takes 90 to 180 days, appeals take longer, and approval is discretionary. This is economic warfare through bureaucracy. Technically legal, practically devastating, and impossible to challenge through international trade mechanisms because China isn't banning anything, just requiring documentation that happens to take months to process. American defense contractors immediately requested expedited licensing. Chinese officials responded that applications would be processed in order received. Estimated processing time, 120-180 days. No exceptions for military procurement, no emergency procedures. Just bureaucratic process moving at exactly the speed designed to create maximum disruption. Within 48 hours, Pentagon procurement officers were calculating inventory. Existing stockpiles of neodymium, dysprosium, and other critical elements would sustain current production for 60-90 days. After that, production lines would shut down, not slow down, stop completely, because these materials have no substitutes. You cannot build an F-35 without them. You cannot produce precision-guided missiles without them, and you cannot wait 180 days for Chinese export licenses without halting weapons production. The impact wasn't theoretical, it was mechanical. On January 13, 2026, Lockheed Martin notified the Pentagon that F-35 production would be suspended within 45 days unless rare earth supplies were secured. Raytheon followed with similar notifications for missile programs. Northrop Grumman confirmed that B-21 bomber production faced delays. Every major defense contractor reported the same problem. Chinese rare earth restrictions had severed supply chains with no domestic alternatives available. Pentagon officials explored alternatives. Could rare earths be sourced from other countries? Australia has deposits but minimal refining capacity. Processing raw ore takes years to develop. Malaysia has some refining but operates at small scale using Chinese technology under Chinese licensing. Vietnam has processing capacity but sources raw materials from China and cannot increase output without Chinese cooperation. Every alternative leads back to China, because rare earth refining isn't just mining, it's complex chemical processing, requiring specialized knowledge, equipment and supply chains that took decades to develop. You cannot rebuild this infrastructure in months, and you cannot substitute other materials because rare earth elements have unique magnetic and electronic properties that existing technology depends on. The strategic bind is absolute. Either American defense production accepts Chinese terms or production stops. There is no third option that operates on timescales relevant to procurement schedules already contracted, and China knows this. The timing of Emergency Directive 2026-001 coincided with Pentagon budget cycles, weapons procurement schedules, and international tensions that make production delays strategically catastrophic. This wasn't random timing, it was pressure applied at maximum leverage. The immediate effect hits procurement. F-35 production suspending means delivery delays for allied countries who ordered aircraft. South Korea, Japan, Poland, all waiting for deliveries that cannot be completed. This undermines alliance relationships and creates defense gaps in regions where American military presence depends on next-generation aircraft. Missile stockpiles face similar problems. Javelin anti-tank missiles, HIMARS rockets, Patriot interceptors all require rare earth components. Current inventories can sustain conflict for limited duration, but sustained operations deplete stocks that cannot be replenished until Chinese rare earth exports resume. Maintenance becomes critical. Existing F-35s require rare earth components for repairs and upgrades. As aircraft age, component replacement becomes essential. Without Chinese rare earth access, maintenance schedules slip, readiness rates decline, and the gap between operational requirements and available aircraft widens. This creates cascading effects. Reduced readiness means fewer deployable aircraft. Fewer deployable aircraft means allies question American security commitments. Allies questioning commitments means strategic deterrence weakens, and weakened deterrence invites exactly the challenges military readiness is designed to prevent. China doesn't need to attack American forces, they just need to prevent America from maintaining the forces required for deterrence, and rare earth restrictions achieve this without firing a shot. The rare earth restriction demonstrates that strategic resources can be weaponized more effectively than military force. China doesn't need to match American military spending. They need to control materials American military spending depends on, and controlling materials is cheaper, less risky, and more effective than building competing weapon systems. This precedent applies beyond rare earths. China controls 80% of global solar panel production, 60% of battery manufacturing, 70% of pharmaceutical ingredient production. Each represents potential leverage point for economic coercion that imposes costs without military confrontation. Other countries are watching and learning. Russia controls significant titanium production essential for aircraft manufacturing. Saudi Arabia controls oil that transportation systems depend on. Democratic Republic of Congo produces cobalt required for electric vehicles and energy storage. Every strategic resource becomes a potential weapon once China demonstrates that economic leverage works. The international response reveals systemic fragility. American officials called Chinese restrictions unacceptable economic warfare. European leaders expressed concern about supply chain vulnerabilities, but expressions of concern don't produce rare earth refining capacity, and calling something unacceptable doesn't make alternatives appear. Japan announced plans to develop rare earth processing. Timeline 8 to 10 years. Australia committed funding for mining expansion. Timeline 5 to 7 years. The United States authorized emergency environmental waivers for domestic processing. Timeline 3 to 5 years minimum. Every solution operates on timescales measured in years, while defense production faces disruption measured in weeks. January 15th, 2026. Pentagon officials brief Congress on rare earth supply chain crisis. The assessment is stark. Without Chinese cooperation, American defense production cannot sustain current output. Weapon systems cannot be delivered, maintenance cannot be completed, and readiness will degrade until alternative supply chains are established. The time frame for alternatives, 3-5 years minimum. The time frame for current stockpiles, 60-90 days maximum. The gap between these timeframes represents strategic vulnerability that cannot be addressed through military spending, diplomatic pressure, or policy statements. China has demonstrated that geological monopoly provides leverage that military superiority cannot overcome. 17 elements that nobody discussed in public meetings now determine whether American weapons production continues or stops, and the country that controls these elements can impose terms that American policymakers must either accept or face defense industrial collapse. This isn't theory, it's happening. Production lines are calculating shutdown dates, contractors are notifying Pentagon, allies are questioning delivery schedules, and everyone is discovering that supply chain dependency isn't abstract risk, it's immediate vulnerability that reshapes strategic calculations. The rare earth restriction will either force American accommodation of Chinese demands or accelerate domestic supply chain development at costs nobody wanted to pay. Either outcome represents Chinese success. Either America accepts Chinese terms or spends vast resources rebuilding capacity that was abandoned for short-term savings. The lesson isn't subtle. Strategic resources matter more than military hardware. Control the inputs, control the outputs. And countries that ignored this truth for decades are now paying the price in disrupted production, delayed deliveries, and weakened deterrence that military spending cannot fix. 72 hours changed the equation, not through military action, through bureaucratic processing times for export licenses that defense contractors cannot circumvent and Pentagon procurement cannot override. That's how resource warfare works, not with explosions, with forms that take 180 days to process while stockpiles run out in 90.